So what Tomas is actually talking about is the level of depth we went through with the numbers, and that's why we're not going to spend time going through the numbers. But in general, these are the four metrics of evaluation that you should be, if you ever are getting to the point where you're evaluating a profile store or co-occurrences, this is what you'd be asking. How many base records are in the profile store? How many of those records are profiles, meaning how many were merged together and had multiple data points? How many channels are in the profile store? And then the fourth, which is like the elephant in the room question, is how successfully synced is each data channel? And that's really the match rate question, right? And so the one thing I think it's critical to answer, and Daniel, I think you had an amazing answer to your, when Josh asked you what you think about match rate in your question.
I call that tap dance.
Well, it was a tap dance. But my straight answer when somebody's asked that question, and the only way I think anybody should answer that is by following up a question with, well, what are you trying to do? And when you're asking me about match rate, what match rate are you referring to? Because in some cases, there could be match rate referring to like your overall footprint in the ecosystem. Some it could be comparing it to one vendor. Some it could be just talking about how many profiles were matched in our solution. And so there's a lot of discovery. And the one reason why I feel very strongly about that is, the head of data and our main client at Kraft, the first meeting I ever had with him, I had 50 minutes to meet him for lunch. This is not like you're, charismatic, let's tell jokes. This guy is like straight arrows possible. And the first thing he said to me is, what's your match rate? And I was like, well, match rate for what? And he was like, well, just what's the match rate? Like, what's the benchmark match rate? Like, what's a good match rate? And I was like, well, that very much depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And he's like, well, for all clients, like, what's a good match rate? I'm like, well, for what? And he asked me on activation, like when I started drilling, and I gave him the example on how my answer for him and for Kraft and what he was trying to accomplish is very different than the answer I give to like a guild group who forces authentication, right? And he took this like minute and he thought about it, he's like, you're right. And I'm like, honestly, we need to work through what you're trying to accomplish, figure out where we are today, and then talk about ways to optimize to improve upon where we are. And, Josh said this yesterday, but 9 times out of 10, that's a legitimate response and a legitimate conversation to have with a client, because if they're really trying to accomplish something, they will recognize that their specific use case has a million different factors that play into it, and the answer is not consistent across the marketplace. So be very careful when someone asks you about match rate, or if someone throws out a number 30%, we had 20% with Turn for an issue, for a use case with Kraft, and in my gut, because I understood what they were trying to accomplish, I knew that wasn't good enough. I didn't necessarily know what ultimately it could be, but I knew ways to recommend to the client to improve what our match rate was with Turn in that instance.
So if you approach this as a discipline, not a single point solution, then the answer becomes very clear. Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. One box in this thing to increase a potential specific match rate could take months to get to. So what are you trying to do? If you're trying to do personalization, maybe it's not about activating that vendor, maybe it's about just getting your own data in order to do personalization, et cetera, et cetera. So if you approach it as a discipline and talk about it as a discipline, a service plus a platform in a new category, it'll make sense to answer that in that way.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's a great point, guys, and I think we could be louder from a marketing perspective in educating people about the realities of the different use cases around match rate. I think the one most common that we run into out in the field is, the one that the librarians and the new stars, the bulk of their business model and revenues are built around, is when I have an offline data source that does not have a hook in it, how do I create a pseudo cookie and match against something that does not have a unique identifier in it?
You know what? I mean, sometimes the best learning experiences, right, in the way that you answer these questions are going through something like Kraft, right? Because there's certain things that you can look at, like, wow, shit, match rate. Like, well, with DFA, we have a super high match rate, right? With your core metrics IDs, we're through the roof, right? For anybody that visits your site and we sync with Turn on your site, we're fucking through the roof. Right? So some of it's just like, if you start to think about it logically, right? And that's the thing. There's no simple answer. It depends on where you're syncing, who you're syncing with, what, you know, like,
But we did learn that the hard way,
Yep.
you and I, right? Like coming at 6 months ago, Brad came to me, he's like, I don't care what we do, we gotta get our match rate with turn up, right?
well,
And
because
we
we knew logically that that's the DSP that they use,
Right, so
but
to
they only,
activate on it,
but you
exactly.
only have 50 million page views a month, right? Meanwhile, you're serving 1.5 billion impressions.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you're not gonna close that gap in terms of syncing if all you are, you know, all you have the ability to do is to set a signal ID when someone comes to the website and then associate it with the turn in that environment, right? We have to figure out a way to sync the turn. If that's where you want to increase your match rate, we have to have a strategy for this other channel.
Right.
These are complicated, you know, like.
Yeah.
They're very difficult.
But and I think that, so Daniel's point is, it's true, we need to take a position of education on it because they are complicated questions and they deserve complicated, well thought out, specific answers. And
It's a good
so
blog post.
there isn't one answer to that question. In the ecosystem, everyone has a different opinion. And Signals is, depending on what that client is trying to do, especially where we sit and what we're actually doing for them, that could be a very different answer depending on who you're speaking to.
Yeah, one of the things I related to it in the last meeting was QPS. Some of the people who did, DSPs were involved with that buying and evaluating demand-side platforms, which is a real-time bidding platform. QPS was a metric that everyone really dwelled on in every RFP. Well, what's your QPS? QPS means queries per second. How many banner ads can you view in a second? It was like, what's your QPS? What's your QPS? Well, Turn, DataZoo, MediaMath, all these DSPs, they weren't selling QPS. They were selling the ability to bid on banners. And so, unfortunately, this match rate question is the QPS of our new discipline. And it's something that with education, with really good, well-thought answers, we're going to be able to own it and really educate people.
Cool. I would say it's 1/3 the technology, 2/3 the discipline. And if we come out to the market and we speak like that, no one else is going to be talking like that, and it's going to ring true.
Well, yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, we're at a point where a lot of people are formulating shady answers as well. So if we get out ahead of that, like we could be that authority. For sure.
Definitely.